Awesome. Okay. So could you go to the next slide, please? So hello, everyone. My name is Rachael Burns, and I'm a PhD student at the Max Planck Institute for Intelligent Systems. And today I'll be talking with you about the work I did with my colleagues, utilizing interviews and thematic analysis to uncover specifications for a companion robot. Next. So I have three main questions I'll try to cover today. The first being, how can we frame our research questions in a way that our intended users can understand and actively contribute? And second, how can we use that qualitative data to shape technical design guidelines? And third, how can we explain this work to others who are maybe unfamiliar with qualitative methods? Next. So to answer this first question, I want to briefly tell you a little bit about my work. So I'm working with my team to create a robot companion for children with autism. And we believe that this robot companion could be especially effective if it utilized touch perception. So we designed a set of initial tactile touch perception requirements that we thought this robot companion should have. And you can see a sample one in the bottom right corner over here. And so that's our sensitivity requirement. And so we had about 5 more requirements. And you can also see the motivation, which was talking about our rationale for each of these requirements. So we had these requirements and we wanted to evaluate them. And so we wanted to work with autism specialists to find out if these requirements were actually what was best for the children, or maybe the therapist had some other advice. So we had 11 participants, and our challenge was, while these autism specialists had deep domain knowledge, they had little background in technology. So we couldn't directly ask them to recommend engineering style specifications. So next. So the way we set about solving this was with a carefully designed and interview study. And the goal of this interview study was to progress from general questions more in the participant's domain and shifting gradually into a more in-depth evaluation of our technical system. So we started with the background of the participant, their experiences working with children with autism, and how they utilize touch. And if the participant said something we were unfamiliar with, or something that sounded particularly interesting, we asked them to please elaborate on it. And next, we moved on to step 2. And this was what we called the ranking task. And so you can see, again, our little sample requirement, and you can see it's on like a little PowerPoint slide. And so what we did is we asked the therapist to click and drag and rearrange these requirements in the order that they felt reflected most important to least important. And we also asked them to explain their thought process out loud so we could check for their understanding and to learn what concepts they prioritized. So next, we moved on to step 3. And this was follow-up questions. And so every requirement had a follow-up question. And this was to encourage a more detailed conversation. So things like, what kinds of touch gestures should the robot detect? And what percentage of the robot's body should be able to detect touch? And this later resulted in some cool figures, as you can see here. So on the next step, step 4, we asked them to comment on the actual prototype tactile sensor and on our prototype robot design. And this was so we could get comments or concerns from actual potential users. So next, for step 5, we had closing recommendations. And this was where the participants had opportunities to kind of leave last points that they thought, things we needed to pay attention to, maybe things we might have not otherwise considered. It was their opportunity to share their wisdom with us. So next, we'll talk about the lessons learned here. I would say building flexibility into your interview is key. Having backup plans determined in advance if you can. For example, we had some participants that had difficulty navigating the video conferencing software or the online PowerPoint editor. So just trying to be prepared for that. Also, choosing words that make sense to your audience, trying to avoid engineering jargon. And as another example, for our follow-up questions, we had one question, the wording was confusing to the first participant, and so we added an example. And then it was clear. And so we incorporated that example in for the rest of our participants. And finally, think about your question order. So for example, we showed our prototype tactile sensor at the end to try and avoid biasing the participant. So next, we'll talk about main question number 2, which is how do we analyze this interview data? So I'll talk a little bit about thematic analysis and then how we use thematic analysis to then finalize our qualitative requirements and create quantitative specifications. Next. So thematic analysis, I've already seen some things on the Miro whiteboard. I saw someone shared the YouTube lecture by Braun and Clark, and that's a really good lecture. I really recommend watching it. That's how I learned about thematic analysis. But to summarize it briefly, thematic analysis is an open and iterative approach for interpreting and organizing qualitative data into meaningful patterns. And so for every participant, we would interview them, and then we would transcribe the interview, and then we would code the interview. So we would go through line by line and look at what the participant said and mark things that were interesting or things that we saw consistently happening through the conversation. And it was really helpful here to have a second coder because we were able to have this exchange, this dialogue. So after we coded separately, we would meet together, discuss, and maybe go back and revisit our codes with a new perspective or things to look out for. And additionally, when it came time to aggregate these codes into themes, we worked on it separately. And then we came together and talked about what we thought, the most important things were, what codes grouped together and made sense. So that was really helpful. So additionally, with thematic analysis, we were able to share some useful things like terminology that the specialists used that readers might not know yet. We were able to use direct quotes to illustrate key concepts really beautifully. And we provided summaries showing how the themes directly related to sensor and robot recommendations. So next, we'll talk about utilizing these themes to finalize these qualitative requirements. So we had our initial qualitative requirements, and then we had all these interviews and thematic analysis. And the first thing we actually did was add a new requirement based on the therapist's recommendations. So one thing that the therapist pointed out is that the feel of the robot is really important. If the robot is unpleasant to touch, the kids aren't even going to use it at all. So we added a feel requirement to our list. Additionally, we edited the requirement names and descriptions to make it more in alignment with what the therapist recommended. So you'll see an example on the right. The sensitivity requirement became the sensing range. And the description shifted to point out and kind of highlight that the sensing range should be similar to that of humans to give the child a more educational experience. So then after we had these final qualitative requirements, we translated them into quantitative specifications. And the first thing we did for that was to return to the literature, and not just HRI literature. We actually ended up looking in a lot of different fields. So continuing with the sensitivity example on the right, to determine the softest touch the robot should be able to detect, we looked into affective touch interaction. So the softest touch, the softest pleasant touch is documented at about 0.4 newtons. And then on the opposite end, maximum force detection, we looked at pain thresholds. So in the human arm, when someone's squeezing, when it goes from uncomfortable to painful, is about 25 newtons. And then best practices with signal processing, we had a minimum signal to noise ratio of 3.3. And throughout this process, for all of these specifications, we tried to be approach agnostic. And so what that means is keeping these specifications in a way that researchers from different sensing modalities and robots and technology methods could utilize them if possible. So next, to wrap things up, we'll talk about main question 3, which is how we talked about this research in our journal publication. And so the main thing I would recommend is to write as though your reader is completely new to thematic analysis, for example. So within your paper, you should have enough detail and explanation written that your reader can understand why you conducted the interview study the way you did, how you set it up, how you did thematic analysis, what thematic analysis is. Enough detail that they shouldn't have to stop what they're doing, put down your paper, and pull up the YouTube lecture on what thematic analysis is. Also using diagrams to supplement your work, like the diagram we had below. And so next, with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention and ask you what comments or questions you might have.